Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine It podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Derald Holtkamp, who is a diagnostician at Iowa State University's veterinary medicine. How are you tonight, Dr. Holtkamp?
I'm good, Laura. Thanks for the invitation to speak with you today here.
Oh, we're excited to have you. And I know maybe the description of a diagnostician isn't correct, but I always kind of group you in that. I know you do a lot of work in epidemiology. And let's maybe, before we jump into the topic at hand, have you give a little bit more of an introduction about yourself. And I know you can do a better job than I can, so I'll let you take the reins.
All right. No, I can do that. And you're right. I'm not a diagnostician, so we should clear that up right away.
Yes.
But I do work in the veterinary diagnostic and production animal medicine department here at Iowa State University. I've been a professor for the last 4 years, started in 2006. So been at Iowa State for quite a few years. Most of my work, Laura, is centered around biosecurity. I'd say that's probably where my passion lies. And so I've worked on a number of things over the years. Also do a little bit on the economics of swine disease, helping evaluate interventions, doing cost benefit analysis, capital budgeting analysis, that type of thing related to animal health. But I think the topic that we're going to talk about today here that is biosecurity is the one I have the most passion for, I'd say.
Absolutely. Yeah, and let's jump right in on that. As we were visiting just before the podcast, we were really just talking briefly about lessons learned with biosecurity and maybe talking a little bit more recently about some of the case studies that we've certainly seen pop up in the state of Iowa around APP. And I think APP is a great conversation. You know, I've had individuals approach me and say, hey, is it coming back? What are we hearing? And I'm not a vet, so I think it's good to hear from the vet. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? And let's walk through kind of, what's been happening here in Iowa.
Sure. Yeah. So APP, of course, is not new. Been around for a long time. We have different serotypes of APP. And the one that sort of has recently become a bigger problem is APP serotype 15. Even that's not new. It dates back to, I think, 2010, even some isolates in Australia. And even in the US here, it would periodically show up. But recently, there was an outbreak in north central Iowa where we had about 20 wean-to-finish or finishing sites that ended up having pretty severe mortality events. And when they submitted diagnostics, it came back APP serotype 15. And so that created, it's raised a lot of questions, but from an epidemiological standpoint of understanding maybe how that bacteria got into those sites, that created a kind of a unique opportunity where we had all these sites that were really clustered very tightly geographically. And so they, in that area that was about 20-mile radius around, let's just call it north central Iowa here, there were about 20 different outbreaks that happened between November 25th and about January 24th of last year, early this year. And so, it immediately raised the question of why is that happening? And by the way, there weren't really any other cases reported outside that area. They were all clustered right there. And so it raised an opportunity for us to kind of explore that to see if we could, pinpoint something specifically that was leading to that. And so what we did is there was 9 different production systems involved with the 20 cases. I'd say the majority had just one site break, but there were several that had multiple sites as well. And so we set out to do an intensive investigation of all. At least one for all 9. We actually achieved 7 of those. There was 2 that chose not to participate in that, but still provided some data to look at the 20 overall. But we did the 7, and there was I would say several interesting things that came out of that. Probably first and foremost, I guess when you look at overall biosecurity in the wean to market phase of production. I knew that was not, going to look very good going into this. And we knew our expectations weren't terribly high. But I would say my expectations have been reset lower in that it's kind of hard to imagine that we could be much worse than we are today. But you never, of course, want to say that, right? You can always get worse, but I would say we have a long way to go there. And we found a lot of things, I guess, that were concerning. Probably the most significant for me was when we first started doing these investigations. We were asking the herd veterinarians and the producers, to tell us more about how rendering was handled. And not all of them used rendering. There was, I think, 2 of the cases we investigated, two of the 7 that used compost, but the rest used rendering, and the majority of the 20 sites that broke during this time also used rendering. And I guess what struck me most was how little is known about that event, right? And most of the time when the deads are picked up, there's nobody there. And so somebody is contracting with, there's a single company in the Iowa here that does all that. And, they're contracted. Somebody within the company knows about that, but the veterinarians don't really know a lot about that after that. And so we actually had the opportunity to have a couple calls with the rendering company. We learned a few things. One was they have geographic areas that they pick up in. And so they have a sort of what they call a collection station. They use the term reload station, but it's a collection point. And so they have the smaller trucks that go around, have routes around the country picking up dead pigs, bring them back to that central location, and then they use a bigger truck then to haul them to the plant. And so nobody really knew about that, I guess, or how that worked until we got on the phone and talked about that. And so the one thing we weren't able to discern, we learned that we could have if the information was shared with us, but we weren't able to get that done. But we weren't able to identify the exact routes and the exact timing of the pickup for these. And so, but when you look at sort of where those happen, when they happen, and we've sort of plotted those with the animation, it's pretty clear they were happening together. And so it's a good bet that those sites were on the common route there. And so we think that rendering was a significant part of that, not the entire picture. There were some other events, there were some repair events that we consider to be significant in this case. Very well could have led to that. There was in one case, it was not one of the farms we investigated, but it came out during the investigation that there was the day that the day or a couple of days when the peak mortality was occurring. They had to bring some help in to help haul out all the mortality. And the site happened to have just a single pair of boots and a single coverall for the caretaker, and that was it. And so the help they brought in came in with their street shoes and street clothes and worked all afternoon to haul out dead pigs. And then at the end of that, there were 2 of the 3 total, but 2 that came in to help the caretaker. One of them was wise enough to know that, I better go home after this and change clothes and shoes. The other one decided that he needed to go to another site that same day and get something done. And that site then broke a few days later. And so, anecdotally, we have those stories as well. But there were several of the sites, too, that were in the marketing phase. And so those, again, we explored livestock transport of market pigs. Mm-hmm. And that, too, could have been involved. But again, that, these pigs were going all over the country being marketed, not all over the country, but all over the state. Mm-hmm. And I just feel like it seemed to me that if that were contributing to a significant amount of the spread, we would have found it more widespread than just in that 20-mile radius. So that's kind of some of the high points from that investigation, Laura.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting. So I think you brought up a couple of good points. Certainly rendering, I think, has been on our list for many years, and I'm not trying to pick on the industry, but again, I think it's just something we recognize is that we're inherently opening up the risk of moving disease around on animals that have, in fact, more than likely died from a disease.
Yeah.
And so, that one I think doesn't really surprise me. But how do we manage those communications with our personnel staff and the repair staff? Because I've heard these before, maybe not quite to that level, but certainly we think about mechanics and so forth, or welders needing to go from site to site. And
Yeah.
And so what are you seeing or suggestions that you have based on what you've seen that we can do?
Yeah. You hit the nail on the head there, the communication piece. And you know, what's going on, I think more and more is, you know, especially since the labor market has gotten relatively tight, more and more companies are relying on a third party service providers to do a lot of that work. So, you know, third party repairs, third party load crews, third party vaccine crews, even a lot of the caretaker labor now is being contracted out to third parties. And as that happens, there is three things that occur. One is, you know, the companies lose a lot of control over that. You know, unless you've got it written in an agreement, if it's something that's going to take time and cost money, you know, good luck getting that done, right? And then in some cases, you know, it's even 2 degrees of separation, right? So they contract with a third party or outside party to manage the site or contract the site or provide the labor on the site. And then that person is responsible for contracting with or somebody else for load crews and vaccine crews or something, you know, sometimes it's manure removal, whatever it is. And so you've got a third party contracting with a third party. And so there's no way that, you know, you expect to have any control over it. So second is you lose knowledge, right? I describe them as black boxes, and that really is not too far off where, you know, as I talk to the veterinarians and even people in management, oftentimes they know relatively little about who the contracted third parties use, you know, whether they're exclusive to the company, if they have an emergency where somebody calls in sick and they need another body there to help load pigs, where does that third person come from? You know, they may say, yeah, we're exclusive to the company, but what happens when they have to bring somebody in? You know, they just don't know. There's no knowledge of that. If they don't find a body and get the job done, they're gonna probably lose that job. But if they bring somebody that maybe was at a site for another company the day before, nobody's probably going to ask about that, and we've trained them well to do that. So the third aspect is what you hit on, the communication piece. When you contract that out to a third party, that communication piece becomes absolutely essential. And I see this happen over and over again where, you know, something bad happens and in cases where they can tie it back to that third party, you know, after the fact, they say things like, you know, they should have known better. Well, you know, it's you can say that, but the reality is, you know, they're not epidemiologists, they're not veterinarians, they're not even producers. And so they have no knowledge over what, you know, when they do something really dumb, really stupid that we think is really stupid, they don't know that necessarily, right? And oftentimes I see this, especially with like manure removal, where it's a seasonal, you know, once a year they're out there and you know, somehow we expect them to remember exactly what we told them last year. And so we don't bother to communicate that again. So it's when you know, contract that third party, that communication piece just becomes paramount. And, you know, it's important all up and down the chain, even when with your employees, right? But it's at another level when you contract out. You really have to, I think, spell everything out, make in writing. It really should be, everything should be in writing, that your expectations should be very clear, and then repeated on a phone call, right? Get on them before they show up to your farm again, or at least periodically if it's something done on a regular basis, and to remind them, here's what we expect to have happen. And so these, you know, in particular, especially the grow finish sites, you know, there's just no oversight there. Those load crews are out there by themselves. Vaccine crews are out there by themselves. Hardly ever have any oversight. And so, you know, I'll confess, if I were in their shoes, I'd probably do the same thing, right? Nobody ever watches me, and I'll probably take the fastest and quickest route to get that job done. So,
yep. And I think you also hit kind of that nail on the head for me too. Is you said that was typical in grow finish, or happens more likely in grow finish. And I think that's very true. It's certainly what I've seen over the years. Sow farms, right? We know the potential for moving disease. We know that there's a great financial risk, and they're probably a little bit more diligently watched than those grow finish barns. And certainly the labor is a little bit different there as well. But what else are you seeing in terms of differences between biosecurity operations on a wean-to-finish versus a sow farm that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of the things that you routinely now see in sow farms, right? Like bench entry and showers and, you know, robotic carts to move the dead, right? Or power carts to move the dead. A lot of those things are just absent in grow finish, right? A lot of the things we've done on the south side, we just haven't got them implemented yet on grow finish, And I think the caution there too is we're starting to see that. We're starting to see some benches show up on wean-to-finish units, and that's not a bad thing. But I would tell you, by far more often than not, those aren't used correctly, right? They're not established as a solid, clean, dirty line. They're set up as a sort of barrier to walk around, and that's how they get used, and so I think we have to be careful about how we put those things in place. Even showers, right? There's more people thinking about putting showers in place in grow finish now. And the reality is, though, we still have a lot of sites that are not connected. None of them are a common roof or not connected by a solid hallway. And so you have people going in and out of the barns. And I guess I have to ask myself, well, how good is that shower going to be if I've got somebody that's, going to be walking outside back and forth the barns? Now, it's probably worth something, right? It's probably going to give me something, but it's certainly not going to be as good if we had everything under a common roof, and then we could establish that then as a clear line of separation and a single point of entry into that site, right? And so that's where I see, I guess, a lot of the investments we've made on the sow farm probably could work in grow finish, but it just hasn't been worth the investment or the time. And time is a big one, Laura. That's the thing another thing that really struck me when we were doing these APP investigations, where, employees are being asked to do an awful, a lot. And as I look at it, I think, okay, what you just described to me, that's a 15-hour day. If you're doing things you say you're doing, right. And that's 7 days a week, 15-hour days, 7 days a week. And I wonder to myself, is that really what's happening in the field? And we're still adding more things, right? We stick a shower in there and we ask them to spend, 5 minutes showering in and 5 minutes showering out. We've added another 10 minutes to their day, and we had one case where a single caretaker was overseeing 8 different sites, and presumably, or at least according to them, would visit all 8 of those sites every day, had to shower in, shower out. And they were also responsible for vaccines, right? And so they had to vaccinate pigs and early pig care as well on top of that. And so I started to do the math in my head, and you give them 15 minutes to drive, 10 minutes to shower. They didn't have a lot of time, right? If they got the dead pigs hauled out, maybe walk through once and check, make sure everybody had feed. My guess is that's about all they could get done, right? They weren't going to get any pigs treated, and certainly if we were asked them to do anything for biosecurity on top of that, that probably wasn't going to get done well either. And so that particular person, I pushed back. I said, surely you're not, showering in, showering out at 8 different sites every day. And they insisted that they were. And their supervisor was sitting right there and said, yeah, I believe him. I trust that he does that. And I had to concede, okay, maybe he does, but I doubt that's much more than getting your hair wet and kind of scrambling through, right? So, but yeah, that's the other, I would say, thing we see. Of course, people who work on sow farms are very pushed too, but I think it's at a whole nother level in grow finish there. The demand we put on the labor there is incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I've walked into a handful of grow finish sites over the years where the shower is there, but there's a few cobwebs in that shower to indicate that, the contract said I needed to have a shower. You didn't say in the contract that I had to shower in every day. You just said that the shower needed to exist, and there's the shower, right?
Yeah.
So, how do we help the producer or the owner of the pigs, enforce those things and encourage people? Because again, we talk about that a lot. If you're a contract grower, maybe you don't have quite as much skin in the game. Certainly if you're a third-party contractor, the look of the finances looks differently, right? Everybody's invested, everybody wants a job, everybody wants income, but the look of the potential impact of not doing something the way we would like to see it done has greater consequences for those that own the pigs. And so is there anything we can do in all of your conversations with the individuals, the caretakers on the farms that might help encourage that enforcement?
Yeah, I usually start answer that question with, I'm not a training expert, right? I have not spent a lot of time, studying how to motivate people, how to train them, right? And but I do recognize that's a critical part of a lot of the biosecurity that control measures that we put in place, right? And so, from a big picture standpoint, when I teach students, one of the things I always describe is what's called the hierarchy of control measures. And this comes from lab safety. And what it basically says is that not all control measures are equal. And, it says the best ones are where you can eliminate a hazard altogether. And so that may be a case where if we can just stop doing that completely, then that's the best. The second best is substitution. And a good example of that would be if we could go from rendering pickup to composting of dead pigs, right? We're substituting one set of hazards for another. Now, granted, that's in that case, it's a much lower set of hazards with composting, but there's still some hazards involved with that. The next best is what are called engineering controls. And those are ones basically that don't involve people, right? Something of the nature of, a good example I can think of from the egg laying industry. Dr. Craig Rolls owns some fairly large egg laying operations, and they've installed conveyor belts in some of the units, and the conveyor belts take the dead chickens from inside the building out to the compost pile, and there's nobody involved in that except at the end. And they have an outside person actually that deals with them as they come off the end of that conveyor belts. But it completely takes anybody out from inside the barn, takes them out of the equation here. They don't have to get those birds even to a doorway. They just they get them, dispose of them completely from inside. And so that's an example of an engineering type control that can really reduce the hazards that are involved in getting those dead birds out the door and getting them to the compost pile. The bottom rung, or the least effective control measure is again, what I'm not sure why they chose this term, but they call them administrative controls. And those are the ones that involve people to do something right. And when I first started talking about that, I used to I would say, and in the pig industry, we have very few pure engineering controls. Almost everything we do involves people in some way or another to do something right. We have some hybrid ones where, people are aided, right, with some engineering, but very few purely engineered controls. And I guess I always just took that for granted that that's just the way it is, right? And at some point, I think it was actually during a conversation with somebody that used to work in the ethanol industry, which is, another biological industry. And now they were, through a family connection, they were managing wean-to-finish barns now for a family operation. And so I quizzed them a little bit about, I said, surely, you have a good understanding of biosecurity because you were in a similar industry, whether it's a biological process. And what they said really struck me. They said, yeah, that's true. He said, but he said, what I've been really taken aback by is how much people are involved in biosecurity in the pig industry, how much time we have to spend doing things. Whereas in the ethanol industry, it's a much more closed process. And so once they get the ingredients in there, it's a closed system while that's fermenting. And so there's just less things for the people to do. Yeah. And so in the swine industry, we have a very open production process where we're bringing things in and out all the time. And by the way, we've created that over the last 35 years. That wasn't, if you go back to when you and I better not speak for you, but when I was young, okay, when you were probably still unborn, you had small family farms, had their own feed mill, had their own boars on site, right? They were the labor. And so you didn't have labor coming in. And so you had a relatively closed system, frankly. And so now we've moved to a very open production system, and that makes it challenging from a biosecurity standpoint now when you got all these things coming in and out. And so that's kind of where we've evolved to there. But where that has led my thinking now, Laura, is that, maybe we need to start looking a little bit more at these engineered controls. Now, there's a reason why we don't have those in place instead of the administrative controls, right? They're more expensive. They require capital investment. And so I think it's, some of those are going to require some innovation to make those inexpensive enough, easy enough to use, those types of things. And so, I think more and more, hopefully there's going to be some entrepreneurial efforts and some really creative thinkers out there, probably not necessarily any individual is going to figure this out. But I think over time, if we start thinking in those terms, looking for those opportunities, I think we'll more and more find those. And I think, some of the things that the Swine Health Information Center is doing, with the recent funding they've acquired through the Food and Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, to try to stimulate some more research and investment in grow-finish biosecurity. Some of those I think will hopefully pay some dividends. But I really do think as an industry we need to sort of disrupt how we're doing things today a little bit and look for some more of those engineering controls, especially where they make economic sense, or at least we can hopefully make them make economic sense. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, you threw out a couple of things there just right at the end about SHIC and some of the things that they're doing in particularly. And one thing that kind of popped into my head as we were talking, and you talked about it initially, you have been asked to go and do these investigations and evaluate what's happened and how it's happened. And yet when we have our veterinarians do that, they may not be able to maybe have a consistent tool, if you will, to find the appropriate things that the vet community feels is important in these investigations. And so is there any work that you're doing on that currently that would help our veterinary staff so that when they do have these outbreaks, they can get a little bit more information and be prepared to really have something that might give them some information about what's happened?
Yeah. And as a little background on that, Laura, this dates all the way back to 2014. I think when we talked before we got on the phone, I think I took us back to 2013, but it goes back even further than that, where, when I first started working in this area, Dale Polson, came to me and had this survey tool, PADRAP it was called eventually. It was really just a biosecurity survey. And so you could take that survey, and there was a risk scoring system behind it and get a score, and you could benchmark those scores. And, I used that instrument. We worked hard on that. We had that web-based and I was always frustrated though, because the question at the end of all those surveys was, okay, so what should I do? Right? What should I prioritize? And I just never felt like we were getting at the heart of that question with PADRAP. And I've come to the conclusion that we'll never do that with a survey. There's just too many complications, too many different variations. You just can't even remotely get close to discovering all those with a survey, right? And I use the term biosecurity hazard now. That's really what I want to understand. I want to understand where those biosecurity hazards are, and those lie in the production processes, how they do them, who does them, when, what they do them with. So it's who, what, when, where, and how. Mm-hmm. And so at some point it occurred to me that we, to get at that question, we need a different approach. And so I started exploring doing, outbreak investigations, and I found that was a time when producers were really interested, and veterinarians too, because something bad had just happened. And so, they wanted to do something at that point. They didn't want that to happen again. And so it just kind of, once we started doing those, I felt like this was it, right? This was the way that I felt we could start to learn more about how these outbreaks were happening, try to do a better job then in prioritizing where we need to shore up, put our control measures in place. And so that's what kind of led me down that path. And then 2013, of course, hit, and PED virus came into the country, and that of course created a common panic, right? It wasn't just an individual producer panicking after an outbreak. It was sort of the whole industry panicking at once. And so, we started to do more of these outbreak investigations, and National Pork Board funded some of those. And actually, I did one, but there were several other parties that had done some of those. And I had the opportunity to summarize a lot of those. So I was given kind of all the reports. And one of the things that really struck me, Laura, was how all over the board they were, right? And how they approached it, what they chose to investigate, what they chose to report. None of them were what I would consider to be very comprehensive, and it didn't appear to me that it was done very systematically. It was more just kind of go out and wing it. You ask questions. Now, I have run across clinics, production systems that are more formal about those, that have their more of a structured process that they do kind of routinely, and so they're out there. But again, there's none of them are the same, right? Everybody's doing these differently, and so at some point in the discussions with Paul Sundberg and at Schick and others, we decided that we wanted to try to do that better, and the approach we took was to say, okay, well, let's see if we can develop industry standard, right? It's kind of an approach that hopefully everybody would agree. Let's generally kind of follow that. And so we put together a working group about a year and a half ago, and that group had just completed its work earlier this year, and really, walk through the terminology, walk through the approach or the methodology, kind of put together a final version of the form we intend to propose to be used. And so we've got all that together now, and we're getting ready to write that up in the Journal of Swine Health and Production, so that'll be out soon. But we're also running it by the American Association of Swine Veterinarians, hoping to get the board to endorse that. And then Schick has recently just provided us funding about a week and a half ago to build a web-based version for that. And so we've just started that effort. And the idea there is make it easier for veterinarians to use it, and then with permission, of course, and maintaining confidentiality, we can capture that data in a database and now start to learn on a broader sort of industry basis than, how these outbreaks are happening. We're hoping to, start to see some patterns in that that will suggest that we need to focus more attention in these particular areas. So that's kind of where we're headed with that. And that's been a long process, but I feel like we're getting to the point where hopefully that will start to have a bigger impact on how quickly we can learn about where our mistakes are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I'm excited for it because I know that has been a long time coming, and I can remember participating in the PED epidemiology evaluations and trying to go through those, not just from a single farm, right, from a whole system. And it can be quite challenging. So any opportunity we can to take different events and put them together into one and look at it more holistically is definitely a value. So I'm excited to see that for sure.
We hope so.
Yes, I'm sure it will be. Well, Derald, I see that our time is about up, and I've really enjoyed our conversation today. And since we've been on a podcast before, I'm not going to ask you all the questions, but I know we've been talking a little bit here today about some different resources or potential resources. And so instead of asking about your favorite swine resource book, might there be a couple of resources that people can go to if they want more information today?
Yeah, well, the outbreak investigation forms that we used, actually, we currently have those in a Word document, and so it's even editable, but those are available on Schick's website, so swinehealth.org. If you go to emerging diseases, I believe at the top, and there'll be a drop down, one of those is rapid response program. And if you go to that page towards the bottom, there's a link to rapid response resources, I believe. And so there's some training material out there on kind of how we think about outbreak investigations. There's, again, a Word document, the template we use to conduct those, and then even an example of, and so we use the same document now, both to conduct the investigation and generate the reports. And so I invite your listeners to go out there and check that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sounds like a great resource. I haven't had a chance to get on that website in a while, so I'll definitely check it out myself. Well, again, Derald, I want to thank you for your time, and for our audience, if you missed it at the beginning, this is Dr. Derald Holtkamp, who works at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Iowa State University. Thank you so much, Derald.
All right. Thank you, Laura.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.elite.com swinenutritionist.com.